Hey Terry, how's it going?
Hi there. Good, thanks. And you?
Doing good. Just trying to go through the days. It's virtual lockdown here still, mostly like it has been like probably a month now since we are, sort of stepping out in any significant fashion. Yeah. How
Yeah.
about at your end?
I'm used to working from home, so it hasn't really made a lot of difference for me.
Oh, okay, okay. That's good. I think that's what I'm hearing. A lot of people who used to work from home, they're happier. So Tommy is part of my team, right? So I asked him to join, right? And we want to see. I mean, if there is not, attendance, we'll probably, s- kill the call earlier. I think we may need to get a bit creative here, right? With the attendance in general, right, on the group. Uh, I'm not sure, what's the best methodology? How is it in general on the CD Foundation, like higher level calls?
Well, I think in general, you need to be quite proactive. So you really need to promote these, and you need to create quite a collaborative environment in order to attract people to attend regularly. So there has to be quite a strong focus and lots of encouragement to get people to contribute.
Yeah, yeah, and when you say you mean like everyone who sort of wanted this group to be started, right? So I think that's probably uh, what we need to do. Go. I mean, for the most part, right? We are having a lot of offline meetings in general, right? With the Tecton community, with the folks on the Google on the Qflow pipeline side, right? So typically, I think that also takes a bit of the audience away, given that some of these meetings are happening on the side, right? But I hear you. Yeah. Uh, who is it? Marcin? Okay, somebody joined and then dropped off. Okay, I'll probably give it maybe a minute more, and if you don't have someone else, right, it probably is best to kill it, right? I mean, the key here is Terry, right? I mean, it has to be worth. I mean, as I said, right? I mean, our goal was not to come and, in the sense, right, do another SIG. We had a pointed goal, right, and we are working towards that pointed goal, either this way or that way. The question is, in general, is it a good fit into the CD Foundation? I think that's probably is what I'm thinking. Like, I mean, if most of the folks here are more with the mindset of CI/CD in general, maybe the home is not right for something like this, right? Or maybe it's a time zone, but yeah, one of those factors.
Well, there's certainly a lot of interest. So I think the real challenge is just in encouraging people to actually come and contribute. Um, so if we can make it an easier environment for people to get involved, uh, and to an extent, some of that can be done online rather than through meetups. But it's nice to actually have the facility for these meetings so that we can deal with some things face to face.
Yeah, yeah. Hey Andrea, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm fine, thanks. Sorry, I
Are you
couldn't.
back from your PTO or you're still on PTO?
I'm still on PTO officially, but I'm joining meetings where I can.
Okay, so I think if you do need to drop, right, I think we probably, since you are on PTO, we don't want to take your time, and once you are back we will sync up. You are in general aware of, right, the set of 10 issues we have created around Tecton currently, right? And hopefully between you
Yeah,
and someone, you can redirect it to the right set of folks and see, if once the PRs are there, right, they're merged at regular cadence, right, at this particular point in time. And once you're back, right, we can probably dive deeper into them. Yeah.
Yep, sure.
Okay. So Terry, I think we can probably, stop this meeting unless, you have other thoughts. Oh, yeah, people joining now. Okay. Who is this? Siamak? Siamak?
Yes, this is Siamak. How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing, Siamak?
I'm all right. Just looking close the door. It's nice.
Okay. So Siamak, are you here for a particular interest? Is there an area where you are more interested in?
I saw on the agenda that Takedown would be discussed, so I thought just call in, say hi, since I'm involved with the Takedown project, also hear what the thoughts are, so on.
Oh, okay. So what is your charter, Siamak? Like where, what do you work in? Which field?
I work I'm a product manager at Red Hat, and work with the downstream product on OpenShift container platform from Red Hat that product is Takedown.
Okay,
So
that.
I'm very, very involved both upstream in the Takedown community and also downstream at Red Hat. I see Andrea is also on the call.
So you guys know each other, you and Andrea?
Yeah, like by name, not by like face to face, but yeah, through the community. That is, I know him.
Yeah, we've not met, but
Andrea works with one of
upstream.
the engineers that I work a lot with, Vincent.
Yeah, I did reach out to Vincent and others as well, right? So if they can join, right? So I think we can possibly, take this opportunity to discuss some of the, just give you, quick background of what we are doing, one part of the SIG, right? So in general, there are, two aspects to the MLOps SIG, but for the reason, I reached out to the Red Hat team and Vincent and you all was essentially, some of the work which we are doing with service, the Kubeflow pipelines, basing it on Tekton, right? And then, there are certain areas where we need, hopefully, a little bit more push so as to get, some of the functionalities within Tekton, right? So at a high level, let me just, just jump to the crux of the matter, right? So are you aware of Kubeflow pipeline, Siamak?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. At a high
Okay.
level, right? Not very detailed, but at a high level, I know what it does and its purpose.
Okay, yeah. So in general, it's a end-to-end, machine learning pipeline engine built on top of currently Argo. By the way, in another news, Argo has moved to CNCF. So essentially it provides, the machine learning functionalities using, tracking experiments, metadata collection, artifact, lineage tracking, a Python DSL for data scientists to craft these pipelines using, Python. Plus, there is a very strong ecosystem which has emerged around it, and the project has become very, very popular, right? So, and recently, Google launched a product based on this, what they are calling, cloud AI platform pipelines, which is essentially Kubeflow pipelines as a service for the most part, but they have done, quite a bit of integration with other parts of the TensorFlow ecosystem there. Right. Now, interestingly, what came out of Google was Argo under the covers, right? Which is essentially, given that their involvement in Tekton, right, is a bit, but that's what the current stage is, right? So what we are trying to do is essentially, take that and rebase it, or instead of saying rebase it, let's say, we are trying to provide Tekton as an engine as well, right, on this. And that means, when somebody starts from the Kubeflow pipeline DSL or the SDK, the first and the most intuitive thing is like, you're able to compile using the DSL to Tecton YAML and then take that Tecton YAML directly to Tecton. So that's what we are calling phase 1. And phase 2 is, much more complex and involved, where we are going and working with the Qflow pipeline team, the TensorFlow extended team, to actually, align around an intermediate representation, which shall become the basis, because we ideally all the three, all of us, right? We don't want to take a strong dependency on one of the YAMLs, whether it's a Tecton YAML or an Argo YAML. We want an intermediate representation so that, in future, if there is a need for another engine to be plugged in, right, hopefully this can be plugged in using this, and all the dependencies which Qflow pipeline UI takes, the API takes, is more around the intermediate representation. So at a high level, right, this is what we are trying to do now. This design doc has a lot of details I've shared with the Red Hat team as well, right, what we are doing. So Andrea, essentially, initially when we started, the first thing was, Andrea actually went ahead and did a comparison between, the capabilities between Argo and Tecton, and, came up with this detailed list, right, which essentially formed the basis of, between all the functionalities. If you see like the Qflow pipeline DSL, it has a lot of these, functionalities defined through the DSL, Python DSL, which are then mapped to a capability either right now in Argo. And then the idea was that, what are the capabilities which we can map it to in Tecton, right? So that's how we perceived. And as we proceeded, right, obviously it became quite clear that, and I think it's also a function of, Argo has been around much longer, right? It's version 2.6, but there were quite a few gaps, right? In fact, a lot of gaps, right, which we encountered as we went through this. So at our last effort, when we are essentially, let me get this out. Not this one. Okay, KP Tecton. Okay. So it's talking to this, and this, right, what we eventually want, right? But when we are running the test currently, the place where we are essentially running the test over, Qflow pipeline test data samples, the core samples, which are essentially, the pipelines which go over all the different Qflow pipeline components, whether it's for distributed model training, serving, hyperparameter optimization, and then, on the third-party pipelines which have been contributed by the likes of, Amazon, Google, Azure, IBM. So overall, at this point, we are 50%, right? Where essentially we still have, halfway mark to go at the very basic level. And I think the areas where we are seeing, major issues is things like volume op, volume snapshot op, resource op. Now, the concept of resource op in general within Argo is, right, they have essentially taken all the Kube native functionalities, right, Kubernetes resources, which you can access from this Python DSL, right? So whether it's secrets, config maps, etc., right? And even the volume implementation to a certain extent depends on that, which is what, one of the major blockers here, right? But as you see, there are other things in this, right? So for example, things like, dynamic parameters, or, being able to pass parameters through to the conditional loops, things like, exit task, Tecton variables, right? So there is a list of like around 70 variables in Argo. Qflow pipeline is not, implementing all of them, but providing support for quite a few of them, which are missing, right? And that's where we are now trying to, work through. So there is a list of high level, I think 10 work items, right? But in general, right, there are quite a few, many more, small improvements which can be made. But that, Tommy, do you have that list handy somewhere? The 10 PRs which we have opened, and can you walk quickly through them?
You mean the 10 issues?
Yeah.
Give me 1 second.
Okay. So while he's grabbing that, any comments?
For me to understand the test that you're showing, like success failure, these are like like which of those test cases are possible to run with Takedown? Is that what it indicates, or could you help me understand the success failure numbers?
So essentially, so what we are doing is, we are taking the pipelines which exist into different parts of Kubeflow, right, which are currently, running successfully on Argo. And then as we are, implementing this compiler, right, so what we are implementing right now is phase one, which is essentially, taking the Kubeflow pipeline SDK or DSL and writing a compiler, which can then compile to a Tekton YAML, right, and then push it on Tekton. Now, as part of that, right, we are taking all the pipelines which are there in the Kubeflow pipeline repository, right, which are currently running successfully on Argo, and then progressively running these tests to see, how many of them are getting successful on Tekton, right? So that's what you see as a representation of right now where we are, right? So 41 out of 84 pipelines are currently, we are able to convert. We are not manually yet trying to go and run each of these on Tekton, but we anticipate that, once they are converted to a valid Tekton YAML, they should be able to run, but that's the next step. But that's what this test is representing. Does it?
Yeah, understood. Sense? Yeah. It does make sense.
Okay. So Tommy, were you able to grab?
Yes, I posted in the chat. So I think at the moment we have 9 issues that are active. Maybe only 4 or 5 of them are essential.
Can you share your screen, Tommy, and maybe walk through a couple of them so that, hey, Jeremy, you joined as well. So just at a high level, Jeremy, Siamak is from Red Hat, on the Tekton side, contributing to Tekton. You probably have met Andrea before. He's our IBM committer on Tekton. And we have someone else, Vijay. Vijay, can you introduce yourself?
Hey, everyone. My name is Vijay Chakilam. I'm the founder of Inferencery, a startup focused on AI and machine learning. And yeah, I mean, I found this group very recently, and I'm very interested in MLOps. I've been trying to adopt the DevOps methodologies in one way or the other into AI and machine learning for the past couple of years, and I'm looking forward to being part of the group.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Nice to meet everyone.
Welcome.
Okay.
Okay. So can you guys see my screen, or?
I can see. I think maybe the higher one, which we probably want to start with, Tommy, is just go through the resource ops one. This is a little bit too low level, but I think that gives an idea to Siamak as well, right? To see what are the kind of things which we are encountering as gaps, right, which need to be handled here.
Sure. So can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
So like this is one of the tasks related to the resource ops. So I think we actually discussed internally. So Andrea actually proposed we should create a catalog task to implement like the same feature where Argo handled their resources. So after like a few discussions, we kind of decided to create like a containers that could handle like all the different actions and also able to handle like success and failure conditions. And from there, we actually go over like a few iterations on like whether based on like keep cuddles using the bash command, or like based on what Argo did with like actually Go language. And then since like Go language is like better to handle all the syntax, so at the very end of it, we kind of decided to go with Golang, and we have just a PR opened it earlier today. We are still in the review process of it. Basically, you should be able to replicate most of the feature that Argo has implemented for the resource op.
Thanks. And do you want to talk about the volume ops as well, Tommy?
Sure. I mean, the volume ops is basically I mean, the volume ops and volume snapshot is basically just like super class of resource ops. So they basically take they generate a PVC manifest, and then they actually try to create a PVC and then get some outputs similar to resource op, but more specific for volumes. So once we have the resource op, then we could pretty much implement volume ops and volume snapshot ops in a similar fashions.
Okay. Okay. Is there anything else, right, where you probably need help, where we haven't gotten any attention so far on one of the issues?
I think one is like we really want to see like looping support in tectons, because one of the issues like right now for looping, we just flatten our loops into like multiple parallel steps, but that is not like 100% replicate of what Argo is. So we actually want to see like real looping features in tecton, so we could replicate that feature.
So,
Yeah.
sorry.
Go ahead.
Can you? I always have this question whether it makes sense to have sort of things like looping constructs in DAGs versus, you know, you would just have a step inside you would have, let's say, some custom resource or whatever that would do the looping, and that would be one step in the DAG. And so what's the sort of do you have like a reasoning for why you think, you know, looping should be sort of a first class concept in the DAG?
I think not in the DAG, but it's more so right now when in Argo, the concept of looping is like when we have like output parameters from one task, that could be like a list of 5 different variables. Then we want to have a task that able to go over the 5 variables and then run it in parallel with 5 containers. So right now we are able to do that with like output parameters from one task. We only could do it with some status variables and manually create like 5 identical tasks to do that loop.
So one of the things, for example, you know, in our Watson speech to text pipelines, Jeremy, when we get, you know, the speech data, the audio data, we are splitting it into multiple chunks, right? So now how many chunks are being split is determined at runtime, and based on those split chunks, right, then, you know, the subset of the pipeline steps, which essentially, you know, take that speech data and convert it to text, right, and then run some analysis, right? So these are all parallel branches which are small, right? So this is in general the core native construct in Argo already, right? And so that's what, you know, we expect to be supported through Tecton.
So I definitely think the pattern is common and a very common use case, and so I do think you would definitely want some way of getting that pattern. The pattern being, you know, you have one step and then the next step is running, you know, a grid search, for lack of a better term, over some set of parameters generated in the previous step. So I think that's a common pattern. I guess the question though that I have is, you know, the way that we achieve that pattern. You know, if you sort of make a loop a first class construct in your workflow spec, then, you know, the workflow spec starts to move from, you know, you have this sort of relatively simple, easy to understand declarative structure for a DAG to being more like being a programming language almost, right? And, you know, if you start adding other things like conditions and variables, it almost becomes Turing complete. And, you know, like if you look at it the other way, right, you could imagine, okay, well, you could have a job or resource that, or a task even, that does this grid search. And maybe that's using Katib or something similar that does the grid search over some set of parameters. And then that's just a single task inside of the workflow So the workflow doesn't sort of have to have first-class support for you know, loops. It can be sort of secondary. And so like that, I guess, you know, I don't know if that's the right approach. It just seems like that's an alternative approach. And I'm kind of curious why we think one approach versus the other might be better or worse.
I don't think, like, you know, we think it's part of it is like, yes, there are, you know, specialized ways to achieve, as you said, what you can do, like, you know, something, if you are more familiar with the domain, like, you know, how, for example, CATIB works, right? So yes, you can use, you know, ways like this. The point is, right, I mean, this is a generic you know, functionality which is supported by the pipelines in general, right? So if somebody needs to use it from the construct of, you know, a generic looping functionality. So I think even abstracting, even when you don't talk about the DSL, right, move the DSL out, like a general CI/CD pipeline, should it support looping as a construct or not, right? That's probably the crux of the question, right? So I think you would probably agree it should, right? And I don't know what's the view from the Tecton community, Andrea or Siamak, on this, but I believe this is probably one of the most common use cases you will get it.
I mean, the use case we do have for sure. I mean, in CI as well. The way we're planning to implement this is kind of like the width in Ansible, if you know what I mean. So within the DAG would still look like a single task, but it kind of fans out in the execution and finds back in terms of the results and outputs that you see from the next task. So you could still treat it as like a single task from other primitive point of view, saying, hey, I want to run this after this task. So you will still be able to do that. And this would kind of be a nice declarative way from my point of view to express this, because if you implement it within a task, it's kind of less transparent, apart from the fact that, well, we don't actually support creating tasks dynamically, but you could, of course, you could run a task that does a certain number of things in your favorite programming language, but that would kind of lose the a part of the declarative side of it.
Okay, thanks.
There is one more aspect to this I just wanted to add. So this is like, this definitely good conversation, a topic that if like loops are relevant or not, and there are like I think that is quite polarized, like in general, not Tecton, if loops are something that should be part of CI/CD because they make it quite difficult to reason and debug them in loops. But like apart from that, if you take a step back, I think what would happen, this is a very natural process that we are going through, that usually what happens, and I guess what has happened with Kubeflow as well, is that Kubeflow, some of the aspects of the DSL, so Kubeflow has a DSL that generates Argo CD constructs, and those get executed. That's how I have understood, at least with my shallow understanding of the topic. But some of that, since Argo CD has been the means of implementation, some of what is needed in Kubeflow is designed from the perspective of what was available from in Argo CD, not necessarily what Kubeflow needs or how it should be implemented. But it affects, like inevitably, it influences a lot what's available in Argo workflows. It affects a lot of how that DSL should look like. Now, I think it's a very healthy exercise to look at, so if something else could be that engine that the DSL converts to. I think it's a healthy process, but there is usually this tendency that I think it's like I see it a lot in the issues that are created, that they don't come from what was the original need and what was the actual use case that needs to be implemented and what are the ways to do that. Like that usually doesn't get discussed. What gets discussed often jumps to, we thought we need that use case, we implemented this way because Argo workflow had it. How do we get what Argo workflow has so that we can do it exactly the same way that they had done at the time because of Argo workflow? I don't know if it makes sense, and I'm generalizing a lot. I'm just trying to say that for some of these areas, it might be worth to like take a step back and see if the thought is to support multiple engines like you described as the actual workflow engine under Kubeflow that DSL transforms to. Argo, Tekton, there might be other things coming along, and there are other existing frameworks that could plug in. I think that that higher level thinking is going to be required, because this flow I don't think would work that on every engine that would get plugged in. The expectation would be that the exact same features of Argo workflow should be present, otherwise Kubeflow cannot use it. Right, that's definitely one way to go, but I think that might not be the best approach if you're thinking to make that pluggable.
Yeah, I think so. There is definitely, more targeted approach right now towards Tekton, but I hear your point, right? And part of it is, yes, some of these features probably did originate from that perspective, but given that, and I think in general for Tekton, right? I mean, it's good to be inspired by something, which has done quite a lot, right? And those features are getting used, right? We can attest to the fact that, if there is a volume ops exposed through the DSL, there is a resource ops, which is exposing a lot of the kube native functionalities like secrets, config maps. They're getting used heavily. So it's beyond just the fact that, they're there because Argo had it. Quite a few of them followed the initial Kubeflow pipeline spec because the community was demanding it, right? So volume ops actually, came later, was contributed by, the community members, because there was need to actually be able to manipulate volumes, which essentially, data scientists, as you will be aware, work a lot with the data under the covers, right? So yeah, I think that probably is needed. I think, Siamak, what we are looking at is, a little bit more, targeted approach at this point in time. I think in general, what we have heard is like, a lot of these features would make sense, right? Realistically, they should be in Tekton. From a feature perspective, right? So if there are things which you think wouldn't make sense, definitely, let's flag that. But out of the ones which we have sort of, mentioned, if you see in the chat, right, there are things which are essentially, we have classified if it is non-essential. If it is non-essential, that's definitely a low priority, but things which are sort of, essential, which we know from our experience that are also getting heavily used in the Kubeflow pipeline community. We want, to see if there is some prioritization and if somebody can start looking at it from a Tekton perspective.
No, I do understand. I didn't mean to like discard this request. I just wanted to like call out that there is probably helpful to have an like open mind in both directions, right? While conversations happen within the Tekton community, to also be open to if some of the alternatives, if they are being like discussed. Not to like the goal, basically not to set the goal as Argo has it, this has to happen in Tekton, but rather Kubeflow needs this and we need this in Tekton, and the conversation like continue to come to the conclusion of how this can be catered for Kubeflow, right? So I didn't mean to like give a blanket answer, but just like the
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and I think some of what one of the reasons I sort of bring up, the loop thing is because I think Tekton may have made certain decisions to eschew certain features for a variety of reasons, and I think those are worth investigating. Maybe it makes sense. There's good reasons to eschew certain features, similar to the way that Customizes eschewed certain features. And I think one of the deeper sort of design issues I think that's I think worth considering is that I think within Kubeflow pipelines and ML pipelines, there's like this tension between sort of task-driven pipelines versus data-driven pipelines. And so what I mean by that, a task-driven pipeline is what you would have with like Airflow or most CI/CD pipelines, where it's I run this binary, then I run that binary, then this binary. And so beforehand, what the workflow should look like. It's all predetermined. And then in ML cases, you start to get more towards data-driven and cases where the pipeline's not fully known at runtime, where it's more like step 1 is going to output 10 items. Then for each of those items, run this step, and then take those 10 results, combine them, and run this step, right? And so, I think one of the questions is, whether it makes sense to have, a single engine that does both patterns, or maybe at some point, if you're going down the data-driven pattern, maybe it makes sense to have sort of a different engine or approach to doing that, as opposed to, trying to shoehorn that into something that's trying to be more like the former pattern, where you have a DAG type workflow.
Thanks, Jeremy. Good point. I believe Andrea pinged a document which I don't have access to. He says that he's going to take it in the Tecton's API workflow working group. I believe it has something to do with the looping functionality. So Siamak, I think you are now aware in general, right, from where we are coming from. So if you can, rally, a bit of your Red Hat Tecton committers as well around some of these, and see, if we can help get these items prioritized, and where it doesn't make sense because, there is a strong opinion, I think definitely, let's flag it out and then we discuss accordingly.
Sure, makes sense. Yeah.
Okay, thanks guys. Thanks for your time, and we'll sync up next time. Thanks again.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye, everyone.